Hello, my name is Darrell Robert Schoon, and in the last two programs I talked about two people who had predicted the current economic collapse and the crises. Professor David Hackett Fischer, professor at college who is also an author and had written an extraordinary book called The Great Wave. And what Professor Fischer had noted was throughout history we have these periods of stability that were interrupted by what he called great waves. And these were waves of rising prices. They would intermittently appear, and as they grew and the prices went higher and higher and higher, they were also accompanied by periods by social catastrophes. The Black Plague, the 100 Years' War, periods of great unrest. And at the end of every great price revolution, the present era would be brought to its knees. Economic collapse would ensue, and a whole nother world would arise in the place of the era that had preceded it. What Professor Fischer said was that one great wave would arose, and it took care of, just wiped out the Middle Ages, wiped it out. And after the Middle Ages, the Renaissance appeared. After the Renaissance, another great wave appeared of rising prices, flattened the Renaissance. Economic collapse, just like the Middle Ages had in the previous era, and the Renaissance was succeeded by what Professor Fischer called the Age of Enlightenment. All right, a period where thought was human reason supplanted the extraordinary period of the Renaissance, but the Renaissance was purely a period where the Catholic Church had ruled uninterruptedly. But after the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment appeared, where new thoughts came in, and a whole nother era of wide-open thinking and critical reason took the place of the Renaissance that had happened before it. Now, what Professor Fischer said was, again, another period came along of rising prices, and this ended up in another period of collapse and ushered in what he called the era of Victorian stability. Now, we're here in 2012, and Professor Fischer said an era of rising prices had begun in 1896, and it now is gaining momentum. Professor Fischer published his book in 1996, and he said that the period of change that we were in, the present great wave, was greater in amplitude than any period of change that he had studied. So in other words, what he said in 1996 was that we were in the middle of a great wave that was about to crest and bring to a close with another economic collapse the present era, the era that he called the era of Victorian stability. Now, we are here in 2012. And in 2007, I presented a paper before a group called the Positive Deviant Network. And in that paper, which made my reputation as an economic theorist, or at least as somebody who predicted what was about to happen, I said that we were, as a culture, as a society, on the verge of another Great Depression. I predicted that real estate prices were going to collapse 40 to 70%. I predicted that the stock market would fall as low as 90%. And I predicted that we are going to enter a period of economic chaos that we hadn't seen in at least 60 to 70 years. And I also predicted that the chaos was going to be worse because it was going to be driven by a monetary crisis, which we didn't have during the last Great Depression. I remember a couple of years ago, some visitors had come from Colorado, in-laws, and I was introduced to one of the people as having said these things. And this was probably 2009. And this person looked at me and said, how did you know this? How did you know this was going to happen? And I had been studying the economics of the Great Depression during the 1990s. And when the dot-com boom happened and collapsed, and when Greenspan slashed interest rates down to 1%, setting in motion an even bigger credit bubble, the U.S. real estate market, by this time I had a context of economic cycles, of booms and busts created by credit. And I understood that what Professor Fischer called the era of Victorian stability was in fact an era of false, not false because that is a loaded term, but an era of that was built upon, as it says in the Bible, on sand. I understood that the great period of the expansion of England into a world power that was based upon the introduction of debt-based money, and that the English central bankers, the bankers had ridden the rise of England and the rise of banking were parallel. Before 1695, when the Bank of England, as the central banks began issuing debt-based money in place of real money based on gold and silver, that flood of credit into the marketplace was like a jolt of steroids into a slumbering system that was waiting to happen. What happened in this period that Professor Fisher calls the area of Victorian stability is extraordinary. And Professor Fisher said this era is coming to a close, and indeed it is. And what I'm going to talk about in the next two programs is the extraordinary period that is coming to an end and the period that is going to replace it. And that period was foreseen by Bucky Fuller. But I want to put this context in a personal framework where you, as you are here, along with I and everybody else on this planet, are entering this period where two things are happening: the collapse of one era and the emergence of another. Now, before the British came along and the bankers with their credit-based money, we didn't have the era that we now see as constant, as real, and as palpable as day and night. We didn't have expansions and contractions. We didn't have what we call business cycles. Now, when the British put in credit and debt into this system, I said it was like steroids, and indeed it was. But it was artificial. The artificial injection of credit into an economy that was basically based upon supply and demand really felt good in the beginning. Because when credit enters a system, it's like money. And notice I said it's like money. Because the difference between credit and money is that real money doesn't have to be repaid. Credit turns into debt that has to be repaid. So what happened is, in our world of modern banking, we believe that now credit is a driver of prosperity. And indeed it is. That's why the central bank has slashed interest rates down to almost zero. That's why the Japanese economy, another modern banking economy, has been at almost zero since 1990. And that's why the United States and Japan are both trapped, and the rest of the world soon will be in what we are seeing today, a deflationary collapse of a credit-based economy. Now, this has never happened in the United States to this degree in the last 100 years. And Professor Fisher predicted that this collapse is going to be a watershed event, a seminal event in modern economics, and indeed it is. What you are seeing, what you are participating in, is a collapse of a way of life, a collapse of an era, the collapse of an epoch. When we entered this in 2007, when it started to collapse, it sent shockwaves through the world. It began in the United States with the collapse of the dot-com bubble in 2000, succeeded by an even bigger speculative bubble, the U.S. real estate bubble. And when it began to really take hold in the world in 2008, it sent shockwaves. The largest insurance issuer in the world, AIG, collapsed. Bear Stearns collapsed. Lehman Brothers collapsed, two major investment banks. And had the United States Federal Reserve not reacted, as it did, the rest of the world would have followed in a collapse of enormous proportions. What happened in the 1930s was about to happen. Now, Ben Bernanke and the central bankers were afraid it was going to. And what they did is they acted quickly. And they acted in a way that they had never done before, with trillions of dollars of liquidity. They backstopped all the banks, and we entered another period, what I call the second period of apparent stability. They saved the banking system temporarily. And now in 2012, that collapse is beginning to it's beginning to regain momentum. And that's what I want to talk about. That's what I want to say, is that the collapse isn't over. It's now in stage 2. Stage 1 was the crash of 2008, followed by an enormous burst of liquidity all the way from the Federal Reserve in the West to China in the East, and we stabilized. It was like the patient was brought into the hospital, put in intensive care, slammed with steroids, which brought its vital signs back, and the family in the waiting room was relieved because they were afraid that that events had taken their course, and they were right, that the patient would have died on the table. But I want to tell you, the response of the revival was only temporary, and it's going to come at a cost. What Professor Fisher predicted in 1996 was not going to be prevented by Ben Bernanke's massive infusion of trillions of dollars of liquidity in the system, nor was it going to be stopped by the Chinese increasing their money supply by 150% in a year and a half. Not at all. What they did was delay the inevitable. The end of the era of Victorian stability, as Professor Fisher called it, is still in motion. It is still in motion. It was only temporarily delayed. These great waves of rising prices that Professor Fisher talked about in his book, The Great Wave, published by Oxford University Press, they last between 80 and 160 years. This wave, according to Dr. Fisher, started in 1896. We are now approximately 120 years into that collapse. 112 years, between 112 years and 120 years into that collapse. But we are cresting. It is building momentum and is about to wash away the world that we have known. Now, to most people, this puts them in a position of intense fear. All right? None of us like change. We don't like it personally, and we don't like it collectively. And we have almost been put to sleep by the central bankers in the last 20 to 30 years, because our prosperity is truly built upon sand. Our prosperity was built upon credit, which is now turned into debt that can never be repaid. And this is what is about to happen to us. The bottom is about to fall out. And change is never appreciated. We don't like change. We don't like it as individuals. We don't like it in the collective sense. But without this change, we would have no growth. And that's the period. If you look back at your lives, you will realize that the crises in your lives have caused you to change the most. This not only happens individually, it happens collectively. And as a people, and as a race, not as as a collective, humanity is about to undergo the greatest change that it has ever encountered. What I want to say to you is that this change is not going to be bad. This change is going to be good. Professor Fisher came to those same conclusions as he watched history progress. In the short time span that he had foreseen, we have gone through 4 great periods of change over the last 800 years. And he said that after every economic collapse, after every era ended, an era that was better than the previous era took its place. Now, I can assure you that during the great change that happened between the medieval age, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance, it wasn't pleasant. Prices went up, economic stability increased, and it was accompanied by the Black Plague. These were not pleasant times. There were times of increasing economic chaos. There were times of increasing social change, and they ended up in the complete economic and social collapse of this existing era. But what emerged out of that, what emerged out of the feudal period, was what we call the Renaissance, the rebirth. That's what a Renaissance is, the rebirth. What I'm telling you is that we are in a like period today. But the rebirth, what is going to happen, has never happened before to us. And that's why in every era you cannot see the period of greater prosperity, of greater integration that is going to succeed it. All you see in the period of change is the falling away of your present era. We are in, however, we are about to enter an extraordinary period that we have never experienced before. That is what, as this period of chaos is increasing, what I want to tell you is that my studies, and I predicted this, I predicted the collapse. I saw it coming. And it is happening. Not exactly as I saw it, because you can never see exactly how a crisis is going to unfold. But it is proceeding exactly as I saw it happening. Now, what I also saw, what I also knew, was that it was going to end in an extraordinary rebirth. That is going to be like light is today. It is very, very different than this period that we are entering in now, that we have not yet finished. But at the end of this, we are not going to have chaos. We are not going to have darkness. We are going to have a world emerge, the likes we have never seen before. What I want to assure you is that we are not in a period of just collapse. We are in a period of rebirth. And Fisher said that, and so did Bucky Fuller. Now, where are we? We are in 1981, Bucky Fuller said we are going to see the collapse of the world's power structures. And indeed, it happened 10 years after he said that. There were two great power structures when Bucky lived. We have the power structure of capitalism, and we have the power structures of communism. Two opposing ideologies. Capitalism was based on the extraordinary expansion of the bankers' debt-based money, which propelled England to world dominion first. Then they transferred that little mechanism of debt-based money to the United States and our central bank. All right? And in 1913, the Federal Reserve was put in place in the United States. And that propelled the United States to world expansion, just like it had propelled England before it. But like England began to falter at the end of the 19th century, so the United States empire began to falter at the end of the 20th. And now, both the United States and England, and all that built its prosperity upon the sands of debt-based money, are collapsing, just like communism collapsed in 1991. When Russia fell in 1991, China, the other great communist power, was already in a period of transition. Russia just totally fell over and broke down, and their vast wealth was bought up by these oligarchs from the West, Western money, and now that you have basically Russia collapsed as a world power as what it had been based on before. China had already begun to shift. The Communist Party power structure, which had arisen in opposition to capitalism, had now shifted to also debt-based money. And so now you have, in 2012, you have the United States, you have England, you have Europe, you have Japan, and China, all whose prosperity is based upon the debt-based money of the bankers, which is now collapsing as Bucky predicted in 1981. First communism went down, now capitalism is going down. You may not believe it, you may not want to believe it, it doesn't matter. There were many communists and believers in the vision that Marx had given that communism was going to bring the dream of equality and shared wealth to the world. What communism brought, irrespective of that dream of equality for all and prosperity for the working man, it brought tremendous pain, tremendous suffering, that millions died in the pursuit of that dream. Now, capitalism is collapsing too. And what I want to tell you is just as much as communism collapsed because of internal economic contradictions, capitalism is collapsing just the same because of internal economic contradictions. It is going to die just like communism died, and it's not going to be pleasant. It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. It's going where prosperity was before, you're going to have privation. You're going to have economic dislocation. You're going to have as Jesus said, the first were going to become last, and the last to become first. But for those of you who are not tied to basic beliefs in the hope that the past is going to continue in the future, for those of you who are seeing a different future, I want to assure you that it is going to get better. And it is going to be so much better when this old era ends and the new era finally comes in to take its place, that what we're going to have is we're going to have really the fruition of what Karl Marx thought was going to happen. An era of prosperity where the rich don't oppress the poor, but it's not going to happen the way he thought it was. It's not going to happen because the workers are going to take over the means of production. It's not going to happen because the bankers are going to be thrown out on their ear, though they will, but they're not going to be thrown out. The bankers are going to leave because it collapsed. The bankers are going to leave because they got what they wanted. They got the world that they wanted. But a house built upon sand is not going to last as the capitalists hoped it would. And it's not going to fall the way the communists thought it would. It's going to pass away because it's time. Because the clock of time, the shift of sand, the shifting sands of time are going to resolve and result in a world that is going to come as it was expected and predicted in the greater vision. And that is what we are on the edge of. We are on the edge of a world far better than the world is passing away. It's not going to be easy. Change never is. Individual change is never easy. Collective change is even harder. And that's what we are in here together. But I want to assure you, I want to tell you that what I know to be true, just like I predicted the collapse, what I know to be true is the era that is going to succeed, this present era, is going to be an era totally unlike we can imagine and totally unlike that we have feared. There are those who think we're going to enter in a period of total chaos. There are those who are warning right now that we are going to have a breakdown of social order that we have never seen. And indeed, we are going to enter into a period of social disorder that we have never seen. But it is not going to be the fearful collapse that they say it's going to be. It is not going to end up in total bloodshed, in total warfare, in total starvation, a darkness that we can only imagine. It is not going to end up like that. We are merely going through the death of an epoch. It's happened before. It's happening now. But just like those epochs were succeeded by ages that were better than the period and age that it replaced, we are going to enter into a golden age. And that's what I want to talk about in our next program. Because the change is not just economic. The change is societal, cultural, and spiritual. And until the old world passes away, we are not going to have the new world. But it's coming. And thank God that it is.